Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 18, Marxism, Marx, Lenin and Mao. And we are going to discuss Mao Tse-tung, now Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976. Born at Xishan in Hunan province of China in 1893, December 26. Mao is the second Marxist revolutionary, Lenin being the first, who brought about a successful revolution in a backward country like China. Moreover, he did so primarily with the help of the peasantry, a class which Marx thought had no revolutionary potential. Even Lenin had not placed much faith in the peasant class. Mao, like Lenin, was both a practitioner of Marxism as also its theoretician. After a little formal education, he joined the army of Hunan province during the 1911 revolution led by Kuomintang KMT, a bourgeois nationalist party of Sun Yat-sen. Soon after the success of the KMT revolution, he moved to Changsha, the capital of Hunan, and later to Peking, now Beijing. It was here that he came under the influence of the radical Marxist leader Li Zedong, who arranged a job for him in the university library. However, he left the job and returned to the Changsha and became active in the Communist Party of China (CPC) between 1921 to 25. He organized the mine workers. He also traveled to various parts of China, which gave him a first-hand impression about the exploitative conditions under which the Chinese peasantry was reeling at that time. This was a period of cooperation between the KMT and the CPC. However, the tension between the two began to develop when the CPC pressed for agrarian reforms, which were not acceptable to the KMT, because they were bound to adversely affect the interest of the KMT members, many of whom were landlords. By 1927, the relations between the KMT and the CPC became so bitter that the KMT decided to hit at the communists. After this break between the KMT and the CPC, Mao was asked to organize a rebellion of Hunan peasants. During the course of this rebellion, Mao wrote his first major work, Analysis of Classes in the Chinese Society. Here he identified the various strata of Chinese peasantry: small, marginal, middle, and the big peasant, and the revolutionary potential of each of them. He highlighted the contradiction between the peasantry and the feudal lords. He argued that in the Chinese conditions, the peasantry was going to be the vanguard of the revolution, unlike Tsarist Russia, where revolution was led by the proletariat. He also identified the strata which could be reliable and vacillating allies in the peasant-led revolution. He attempted the harvest uprising of peasants in 1928, but the uprising was crushed and Mao had to flee along with his supporters to Qingkanshan, now Jingshan mountains. From these mountains, Mao's party started its guerrilla warfare tactics. By this, Mao became the originator of guerrilla warfare within the Marxian revolutionary framework. By these tactics, the CPC was able to capture various parts of the southeast China. It set up a number of peasant Soviets in the captured area. These successes of the CPC in the rural China, however, were not according to the policy laid down by the Communist International, which had been advocating that the revolution must begin from the urban centers. The urban centered revolution, Mao thought, was bound to fail in China because there was a very small proletariat. Therefore, he continued his guerrilla warfare tactics in the rural areas. The KMT tried to crush these guerrilla attacks and encircled the areas where peasant Soviets had been set up. Finally, the KMT armies drove out the revolutionaries who took shelter in the northwest hills of China. This escape became famous as Mao's Long March. This also made Mao a undisputed leader of the CPC, a position which he maintained till his death. Mao's stay in the northwest Yan'an province was the most fruitful period for the CPC. It was here that Mao began an extensive study of Marxist philosophy. Mao is believed to have written two serious pieces during this period, one entitled On Practice and the other called On Contradiction, both of which were published after the success of the Chinese Revolution. In the 1940s, he gave a blueprint of the future Chinese government titled New Democracy in 1945. During the 1942-43, Mao consolidated his position in the CPC by eliminating all his possible potential rivals through a rectification campaign. He also advocated a strategy of mass mobilization of peasants, which is known as Mao's mass line. Here he took a highly nationalist posture against the Japanese invasion and tried to organize the Chinese people around the national sentiments. He also refined his theory and practice of guerrilla warfare. The threat to Chinese security during the Second World War again brought the KMT and the CPC together. When the cooperation between two finally ended in 1949, Mao became the head of the Chinese state, which began to be called the People's Republic of China (PRC). During the course of reconstruction of the Chinese society, Mao gave a model different from the one envisaged by Marx in his writings or the one attempted by Lenin in the Soviet Union. In the early 1950s, Mao gave his famous call of "Let 100 flowers bloom," which allowed different viewpoints in the CPC to be expressed freely and openly. Later, he attempted collectivization of agriculture, followed by a call for a great leap forward to bring about quick transition to communism in China. These attempts of Mao did not fully succeed, which generated some resentment and even opposition to Mao's management of the economic agenda. Mao tried to fight this opposition on an ideological plank and gave a call for a cultural revolution in 1966. This was an attempt at recharging the revolutionary zeal of the CPC cadres. He remained wedded to this idea till his death in 1976, September 9. Now let us discuss some points. The first one is peasant revolution. While the Marxist Lenin legacy greatly influenced him, Mao is a great innovator in his own right. He modified Marxism Leninism by relying heavily on the peasantry revolutionary potential. He needed to be remembered that Marx has treated his peasantry with some degree of contempt. For the most part, peasantry for him was conservative and reactionary. It was no more than a big bag of potatoes, unable to make a revolution. Even Lenin had relied mainly on the proletariat in the urban centers of Russia for mass insurrections and had not placed much faith in the peasantry's revolutionary potential. Mao's fundamental contribution, therefore, was to bring about a successful revolution in China, mainly with the help of the peasantry. More than anything else, his revolutionary model became relevant for several Afro-Asian peasant societies. Secondly, Mao in his Cultural Revolution phase drew some lessons from the course of post-revolutionary reconstruction in the Soviet Union and warned, like Milovan Dajilas, against the emergence of the new bourgeois class who were beneficiaries of the transitional period. In other words, Mao was aware that the party's top hierarchy could itself become a new class. Mao used this argument to sideline his rivals in the top echelons of the CPC. The second point is contradictions. In Marx's theory, the main vehicle of all changes in society is contradiction. Mao further elaborated this idea. For him, contradictions or the unity of opposition thesis and antithesis leading to a higher level and transforming quality into quality was the fundamental law of historical development. But he did not fully endorse the Marxist position on contradiction. It may be mentioned that the Marx in his writings seems to have used the terms contradictions and antagonism almost interchangeably. However, Lenin began to distinguish between the two. He expressed the view that contradictions would remain even in a socialist society, but antagonism would not. Mao immensely enriched the debate. In his famous essay titled On Contradictions, 1937, he formulated the notions of antagonistic contradictions and non-antagonist contradictions. According to him, antagonist contradictions are those which can be resolved peacefully. In his own correct handling of contradictions, Mao further elaborated this view. He argued that contradictions between the peasantry and the proletariat were non-antagonistic. The contradictions between the peasantry and the proletariat on one hand and the petty bourgeoisie on the other were non-antagonistic. The contradictions between the peasantry, the proletariat, and the petty bourgeoisie on the one hand and the national bourgeoisie on the other were non-antagonistic. Contradictions between the various communist parties were non-antagonistic. But contradictions between the Chinese people and the comprador bourgeoisie were antagonistic. Contradiction between the socialist and the capitalist camp were antagonistic. Contradictions between the colonial countries and imperialism were antagonistic. He also argued that at any one point of time, one contradiction becomes the principal contradiction, whereas the other contradictions become minor. Further, he argued that even a principal contradiction has a principal aspect and several minor aspects. For example, in the era of imperialism, the contradiction between the imperialist camp on the one hand and the socialist camp and colonial countries on the other is a principal contradiction, and contradiction between the Soviet Union and the USA was a principal aspect of this principal contradiction. However, he also added that which contradiction is to be treated as antagonistic and principal, and which as minor and non antagonistic, or which aspect is to be treated as principal, would be contingent on relative historical tactical considerations. The next point is on practice. This elaboration of contradictions led Mao to expound his epistemology or theory of knowledge. In his famous essay titled On Practice in 1973, Mao argued that all knowledge of the real world comes to us through concrete investigation and empirical analysis. He was opposed to mere book learning or intuitive theorizing. For example, if one wanted to understand the Chinese society, then one must understand its class structure, its pattern of land ownership, and the impact of imperialism on the local economy of China. Theory without continuous reference to empirical reality would become a mere dogma. However, he visualized two stages in the understanding of empirical reality: the perceptual stage and the conceptual stage. At the perceptual stage, we only get the impression of reality through our senses. This sense perception has to be compounded into conceptual knowledge. For example, when one looks at empirical reality of rural China, it is only the perceptual stage of knowledge. But having seen this reality, one has to understand it in terms of different stratas of peasantry, landless, marginal, small, middle, and big farmers, etc. That is the conceptual stage. The next point is United Front and New Democracy. Mao realized that the peasantry in China was not strong enough to win the revolutionary struggle against imperialism and feudalism. Therefore, it was necessary to seek the help of the other classes of Chinese society. It was in this context that Mao emphasized the concept of a united front. It was seen as an alliance between different partners who had some common interest like opposition to imperialism. The nature of such a united front would depend on the historical situation. Its object was to be pursue the resolution of the principal contradiction. Such a united front strategy was employed by Mao by establishing the alliance of Chinese peasantry with the proletariat, the petty bourgeois, and even the national bourgeois. It also intended the non-party elements among the Chinese intellectuals. The United Front had to be a broad alliance of the Chinese people against Japanese imperialism and Western powers. In pursuance of his United Front strategy, Mao gave a call in 1940 for a new democratic republic of China. It was to be a state under the joint dictatorship of several classes. In 1945, he proposed a state system which is called New Democracy. While the United Front consisted of an overwhelming majority of the Chinese people, the leading position in the alliance had to be in the hands of the working class. It meant that the petty bourgeois and the national bourgeois would not only be partners in the united fronts, they would also be partners of the ruling alliance. But they had to be only junior partners. He called such a state as People's Democratic Dictatorship. It was a combination of two aspects: democracy for the people and dictatorship over the enemies of the people, or the running dogs of imperialism. In concrete terms, it meant that the Chinese democratic state would incorporate the peasantry, the working class, the petty bourgeois, and the national bourgeois in the ruling alliance. In doing so, Mao deviated from the classical Marxist notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In fact, he combined Marxism and nationalism. Now let us sum up the unit. In this unit, we have discussed the founders and two prominent advocates of Marxism, Marx, Lenin, and Mao. We have discussed Marx's theory of alienation, historical materialism, surplus value, class war, and revolution. Broadly, Marx's view on the state, dictatorship of the proletariat, and the socialist society are also mentioned. This is followed by a discussion of Lenin's ideas on party organization and democratic centralism, his theory of imperialism, and his views on the nature of the post revolutionary state. Lenin's views about selectivity of place and time of revolution as against the Marxist view about spontaneity are also discussed. Finally, Mao's views about the classes in the Chinese society, his notion of peasant revolution, his views on contradictions and new democracy are discussed. Maoist notion of antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions is an important contribution to the Marxist theory. In addition to it, his advocacy of let 100 flowers bloom and great leap forward is also discussed. Now we want to wind up this lecture and thank you so much for your attention.